Let's talk about a really crazy case of why we study pedigrees. One of the weirdest examples of inbreeding was in the Spanish royal family with the inbreeding of King Charles II of Spain. His real name is Carlos, but we Americanize it and we call him King Charles II. He lived to be 38 years old, and he is the classical case of why inbreeding is so bad. Let's look at his pedigree. So if you look here, his great grandparents, this is the craziest thing. I'm going to look at my notes real quick. His great grandparents had the same parents. Pretty gross. Their kids all married cousins. So gross. He is more inbred by the time you track it all the way down here to the bottom. He is more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. His father, right here, King Philip the is that fourth? Yeah, King Philip the Fourth of Spain, and his mother over here, Mariana. Um, they were cousins. In addition to that, they were uncle and niece. And so Charles is their son. Yep, King Philip the Fourth and Mariana. He was their son, but he was also his father's nephew, great nephew, and his mother's first cousin, and his father's second cousin, all at the same time. That is straight nasty. Just gross. And because of all of that inbreeding, all of those recessive traits that we would normally see skipping generations in pedigrees, all of those recessive things stop hiding because all of those genes are common now. In fact, 25% of his genes were common, which means that they were identical from dad and identical from mom. So if there's any chance of a recessive trait popping up, that chance is going to be multiplied. So much greater chance of getting a horrible recessive trait when you have inbreeding. So here's some facts about King Charles II. This is one of the best, most flattering portraits we have of him. Here are some of his problems. He is the only surviving son of his father's two marriages. Both marriages, not a lot of healthy kids. Most of them died before they turned a year old, lots of miscarriages, and typically that means that there's something genetically wrong in that family. If these babies aren't making it, there's a lot of health concerns. Um, he became king at the age of 3 because of his father's health concerns. His father died, so suddenly this baby at 3 years old is king. But he had a lot of problems. He didn't speak until he was 4 years old. That jaw that you see a lot in these family photos, that big underbite, in a jaw, his was so pronounced that he couldn't actually even close his mouth ever. So eating, speaking, not really a great thing for poor King Charles. He was so deformed that he didn't speak until he was 4 years old. He was treated like a baby and never educated. He never learned to read, write, do math, maps, geography, public speaking. He didn't have any lessons. He didn't walk until he was somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, walking unassisted. He had a lot of physical problems. Um, Eventually, he did marry twice. Both of his wives um, described him as ugly, horrifying. His first wife was so horrified that she tried to get out of the wedding, but because of political pressure, she couldn't get out of the wedding. He didn't actually show up to his own wedding because she was so grossed out by him and because he was so frail and ill that he couldn't be there for his own wedding. Pretty gross. She was under a ton of pressure because he's the last surviving king of Spain and they didn't want to go through all this political nonsense. She was under a ton of pressure to produce a baby, to produce a male heir for the throne. And that pressure became so great that she actually may have committed suicide. There's not a lot of good evidence. She may have died of poisoning as well because she was unable to produce an heir. I think maybe there was some political Game of Thrones kind of stuff going on where she was poisoned and died. So he got remarried, again, could not produce any children. There's a lot of reasons why. He had a lot of inherited diseases because of this inbreeding. They think he may have had hormone deficiency, maybe Fragile X syndrome, maybe Klinefelter syndrome, maybe hydrocephalus, which is a problem with water in your brain, which is not cool. He had seizures and he was constantly on the verge of death until he turned 38 and eventually did pass away. He went completely crazy in his final years. He had so much pressure to rule his country and he had no education. He had no mental capacity to handle that pressure that he actually started communicating with his dead ancestors and going down into the crypts and like touching their bodies and trying to ask for advice from his dead great uncle, who was also his second cousin, and the weirdness. And then he started ordering his like royal helpers to start digging up those dead bodies of even older ancestors and pulling them out of the crypt so he could ask their advice on how to run Spain. So he was quietly retired to a farm, if that makes sense, so that he wouldn't mess up his country. He, upon his autopsy and his death, they found out that he had a heart the size of a peppercorn, so a really shrunk, shriveled down heart. He had corroded lungs, really horrible lung issues, trouble breathing. His intestines were rotten and full of gangrene right away at his death. He only had one testicle. That makes sense why he couldn't have any kids. And then his brain, like I had mentioned earlier, was filled with water from his spinal column, which results in a lot of the mental retardation and mental deficiencies that we saw with him throughout his life. He was known as the Mad King or the Bewitched King because of all of these issues. So, is it important to study inbreeding? Is it important to study pedigrees? Yes. I have to think that if they had known more about pedigrees and genetics back in this time, they wouldn't have had all of this crazy inbreeding happen, and we could have avoided a lot of these horrible inbreeding deficiencies that King Charles II had to suffer with. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Pretty sad story. There is a link in your PDF for the week with the distance learning week at a glance for you. If you wanted to learn more about him and more about this crazy scenario that caused that much inbreeding in that family and why they would think that this was okay, there's a pretty cool article in that. Let's talk about after inbreeding. This is just funny. After inbreeding, let's talk about something that was also pretty crazy that was happening at the time of the early 1900s here in the US. This is something called the eugenics movement. And this scares the bejeebus out of me because eugenics movement happened when people were studying pedigrees and studying eugenics and decided to make some pretty drastic political and legal moves based on science that wasn't very good. So what they said is we can direct human evolution. We can make people better because we know about pedigrees, because we know about genetics. We can make our country and our genetics of our country better. So we're going to look at all of these statistics. We're going to look at politics. We're going to look at geography. We're going to look at science and all of these really good scientific fields here: anatomy, physiology, psychology, medicine, psychiatry. We're going to look at all of that, and we are going to make our gene pool of humans better. This is really bad stuff. I don't want you to think that this was a good idea. This was a idea, horrible idea, and not based on sound science. But because of it, 65,000 Americans with mental illnesses, things like autism, schizophrenia, mental retardation, um, disabilities like dyslexia, even, they were sterilized. That means that medically they were taken in, surgeries were performed to give them the snip or have their tubes tied so that they could never, ever have children. And the US Supreme Court supported this. In the South, this happened to a lot of poor people. They were coerced. They were told, you're not going to get your welfare benefits, or if you can't read, we're just going to lie to you and make you sign this form. And they were sterilized against their will sometimes. A third of the sterilizations done in the state of North Carolina were done on girls starting at age 9 to 18. So, of those sterilizations, most of those were done on very young women. And that is a terrible statistic. They became so common in those southern states that they were known as Mississippi appendectomies. These girls were brought in for what they thought was just a normal routine surgery, but it was used to train medical students as practice. So they would target specific groups, specific communities, specific racial groups, ethnic groups, socioeconomic classes, the poor people of these communities, and they would bring them in as practice for medical students, and they would do surgeries to sterilize these females for the rest of their lives. They could never have children. In Native Americans, this continued throughout the 1970s, many times against their will. If they were hospitalized for another reason, for example, if they needed to have their gallbladder removed, or they were looking for stomach problem, or maybe they needed to do a surgery for something else, as long as they were in there, they decided they would just sterilize these women. And that's horrible. 25% of them that were sterilized without their consent. They were never told or they flat out refused, and the surgery was performed anyway. Just a terribly sad fact. And don't think that this happened forever long ago and then stopped. It's actually continued throughout the early 2000s. When we did some research on California prison systems, dozens of female inmates were sterilized without their consent for a grand total in the 150s to almost 200 female inmates were sterilized because they had genetic traits that we determined we didn't want passed on to the next generation. Pretty ugly stuff. And it started here in Minnesota. So this is a telegraph, very, very old telegraph that was written to Adolf Hitler from a man in Minnesota. And his name, oh, I can't remember his name now. Fremont Dite, sorry, Fremont Dite. And he was a doctor here in Minnesota and the president of the Minnesota Eugenics Society. And this is what he wrote. He said, I praise your plan to stamp out mental inferiority among the German people. We hope that this will be a success and will advance eugenics in Germany as well as here. So Minnesota was looking at people with mental inferiority, the way that they phrased it, people who were mentally deficient, mentally handicapped, or had traits that we didn't like. And he said, this is a good thing that you're doing, stamping that out in the German people. We're doing the same thing here. Now, we didn't murder people in a massive genocide, but we did sterilize them and prevent them from having families. And that's also really horrible. So, this is how it was advertised. You might think, how in the world did people fall for this? Why did people think it was okay to sterilize people against their will? Well, it was a lot of propaganda campaigns, just like it was in Nazi Germany. Lots of propaganda. So they would put up signs around cities, near schools, etc., where they would have flashing lights. And those flashing lights would say, every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of people with bad heredity, such as the insane, the feeble minded, criminals, and other defectives. So they were saying that if people are defective, we should be sterilizing them so they don't continue passing on these defective genetics and having entire generations and huge populations of people with horrible traits. They would have baby shows, just like they have a dog show or a horse show to pick out, oh, which one's the prettiest pony? They would have that for families where they would have to show off their pedigrees. And they would determine and give you a little medal and a little sticker if you had a great pedigree with no defective traits. And if you did have defective traits, then that was advertised too. And it would be really hard to get a date if your family had been deemed to be defective and deficient and have a bad pedigree at this time. They would have these little newspaper clippings and say, hey, you won the best baby contest. And then, of course, everybody's going to want to marry into your family because you've got a great pedigree. But they would educate young women at school. They would give them classes. I actually have an old textbook on fit and unfit matings. It's creepy as all get out. But in that old textbook, they would explain to you why a abnormal pairing would be all the kids are abnormal now, or if you're tainted and abnormal, then you're going to have this pedigree. And they would advertise it like, hey, we monitor the pedigrees of our pigs, our chickens, our cows. We monitor the pedigrees of our perfect dogs, our AKC registered golden retrievers. We should pay attention to this in our children as well and make sure that we're not passing on defective traits. And this unfortunately resulted in a lot of social outcast. So if a family had a trait, even if it's not even genetic, they would be completely outcast and it would be really hard for that family. One really horrible case occurred in the family of Carrie and Emma Buck. So this is Carrie, the younger one here on the left, and this is Emma, her mother, and this happened in the early 1920s. Emma was probably schizophrenic, maybe bipolar, but that never got diagnosed in the 1920s. She was just seen as mentally inferior. She was seen as being an imbecile, actually, is the term that they used. And so she was sent to a mental hospital. She also had a daughter out of wedlock, so she wasn't married when Carrie was born, and so she was determined to be very promiscuous. And they thought that was a genetic trait, something that you could inherit to have a baby without being married. They thought was a genetic deficiency, which we know is ridiculous. But because Emma gave birth to Carrie out of wedlock, and then Carrie also had some mental issues, maybe not the brightest person, they said that they were both imbeciles. And the sad thing is that Carrie grew up in foster care, and while in foster care, she was sexually assaulted, and she also had a baby out of wedlock. They took that baby away from her, and they brought this case to the Supreme Court, and they said, isn't 3 generations, Emma, Carrie, and now her baby, isn't 3 generations of imbeciles enough? All of these people are going to end up in foster care. All of these people are going to need welfare. It's too expensive. Can we just sterilize them? And the Supreme Court said, yes. Terrifying as that is, even though the only reason Carrie had a child out of wedlock is because she was assaulted, they tested that 6-month-old baby and said, nope, this baby's got mental problems as well, probably never going to make it. Let's sterilize them all. And they did, even though Carrie fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. Without her consent, against her will, she was brought to a hospital and a surgery was performed that she could never have children again. Her daughter, Vivian, actually ended up being an honor roll student, but the law went into effect. And after that law was passed in Virginia, most other states also passed similar laws, saying that if you could prove 3 generations were defective, you could sterilize people. And that law is still in effect today, which is pretty crazy. Now, it's not used, it's not enforced, but it's never been taken off the books. So, what kind of traits could they sterilize you for? Here are the ones that we were legally authorized. If you could prove that 3 generations of your family had any of these traits, they could take you into the hospital and give you the snip. Not cool. So, my family, just to speak from it personally, we are a family of Irish immigrants who were very poor and also suffered from a lot of alcoholism. So, if you look here, inebriates. 3 generations of my family have that in our pedigree. Is alcoholism genetic? No, not necessarily. A lot of that has to deal with mental health. Yes, things like depression and anxiety and things in my family, for sure. But a lot of that is also just a learned behavior. Okay, it's not necessarily genetic. People who are chronic criminals. Is it genetic to be a thief? No, but they totally believed that it was. It's taught to you by your environment, but it is not genetic. Okay, being blind and deaf and deformed. Yes, some of those are genetic, but a lot of those things are not. Maybe you're deformed because you were in a horrible farming accident. Maybe you're deaf because you came back from the war and you had cannon fire damage. Whatever it is. Orphans. If there are generation after generation of orphans in your family, is that genetic? No, you unfortunately had the loss of a parent. That's not genetic, but they could still sterilize you. Things like being a homeless person, being somebody who moved frequently home to home, all of that they could sterilize you for against your will, and that was the law. Why was it law? Because we thought incorrectly that this was backed up by good science. We had pedigrees, we had Punnett squares, but it's not good science because most of these traits are not genetically inherited. And not everything is passed along on a pedigree through simple, this is dominant, this is recessive, this is X-linked, this is autosomal. Most traits are not inherited that simply. So what I want you to remember from this is that all of the stuff we're learning about genetics, it's super important. However, unfortunately, if people don't understand the science, that science can be abused. I encourage you to check out the Eugenics Archive at eugenicsarchive.org. The link is given to you guys in the PDF, We Get a Glance. Check it out, see what happened with the scenario, and then write your response. Let me know what you thought of it, and then figure out how you can carry this message forward. How do we prevent future generations from making the same mistake? Using what we know about genetics, DNA, and what we know about pedigrees, how do we make sure that people don't abuse this to judge people or to unfortunately make some big political changes that are not all of that positive? Okay, good luck to everybody. Thank you so much for listening to this crazy long video. I hope you have a great day, and that if you need help, please, 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 I pray that you connect with us. Make sure that you attend some of those help sessions and get the help you need, okay? Have a fantastic day.